Back to today's video. Today is Thursday, August 15th. I'm losing track of time here as this election gets closer and closer. 81 days out, we are going to be talking about three battleground state polls. One state in particular, Pennsylvania, that has seen the New York Times, Quinnipiac University, and Franklin and Marshall College in 3 consecutive days release polls about this battleground state that should tell us a lot about where the current state of the race is in Pennsylvania with its 19 electoral votes. Pennsylvania has been at the forefront of our political conversations, especially as both the Democratic campaigns and Republican campaigns look to it as a prime opportunity, not only for the presidential level, but also on the congressional level, whether the Senate or the House, and potentially even a state legislative flip in either chamber this coming November. Now, Pennsylvania has always been a pretty close state. In 2012, it was a single-digit state. In 2016, Trump flipped the state for the first time in 24 years. And then in 2020, Biden flipped it back, but just by around 1 percentage point. And so knowing its history and knowing how close Pennsylvania has been in the past, in 2024, there is no expectation that Pennsylvania should be a massive state for either side of the aisle. But under the Joe Biden and Donald Trump matchup, on the day that Joe Biden dropped out of the race, the numbers looked far worse for the Democrats, with Donald Trump at the advantage point of 4.5% in terms of his lead over Joe Biden. It was a lead that had been pretty substantial and had been maintained for quite some time, but was building up in the immediate aftermath of the first presidential debate that ultimately ended with Joe Biden dropping out of the presidential race. With the 2024 race in Pennsylvania, it also spread to other states where Michigan and Wisconsin, who largely do vote with the state of Pennsylvania and hold very similar voter sentiments and voter demographics, also started turning away from President Biden as well as the larger Democratic Party. But then came Kamala Harris, and she completely changed everything not only on the national level, but also in states like Pennsylvania. When Joe Biden dropped out of the race, he was losing nationally by roughly 3 points. Today, Kamala Harris leads by 1. And that 4-point swing actually is translated to a bit more than what we've seen just across the national map. The 4-point swing has, in fact, narrowed down Pennsylvania quite tremendously, and the 3 recent polls here are tremendous ones for Kamala Harris's campaign because they show a consistency that we hadn't seen in Pennsylvania for quite some time, unless it was predicting that Joe Biden was losing the state to Donald Trump. Because for a while in the immediate aftermath of Joe Biden dropping out of the race, Kamala Harris was polling roughly 4 points behind Donald Trump in the first set of polls that were released. The average here, just 3 days after Joe Biden withdrew from the race, he was up 4 points. Trump was up 4 points against Kamala Harris. But as she had more time to campaign and voters got to know her well and got to see her on the campaign trail, in advertisements on social media, her numbers started to increase tremendously. She went from 44.3% today to now 3 points higher at 47.6%. In fact, 3.3% higher. Donald Trump, however, has lost roughly half a point since that initial dropout. And that is substantial. That is a position where Donald Trump was initially slated to do quite well. The lead was pretty substantial, that he had room to fall, but that room and that gap had been narrowing, and now Kamala Harris is losing on the Real Clear Politics average by just 0.2% statewide. And when you take a look at the numbers on 538, which is also quite accurate, you can see that where we are right now for the 2024 election in the general in Pennsylvania, Democrats do pull out the overall advantage ahead. And so this is good news, I would say, for the Democratic Party in Pennsylvania at baseline. I mean, they are looking at numbers that show them in a really strong position, against Donald Trump, in contrast with what we had seen previously. And when you take a look at the numbers from the New York Times and Quinnipiac University and Franklin and Marshall, they all provide an individual lens that help us understand this race from multiple perspectives, from multiple different pollsters. Allow me to explain. When it comes down to the New York Times and Siena College poll, they are an A+ rated pollster. They are some of the most accurate pollsters in this entire nation. They are, really good when it comes down to gauging political races, but sometimes they are wrong. But in this case, they had predicted, and they had found a result here, with Kamala Harris ahead by 4 points. And while a 4-point lead in Pennsylvania was absolutely phenomenal news for the Democratic Party, it had to be substantiated and pretty much reaffirmed by some consistency in data points. We talked about the Cook Political Report data point yesterday that showed Kamala Harris with an advantage, and so that also continues to reaffirm that Kamala Harris is, in fact, in the lead in Pennsylvania. But then came Quinnipiac University, another top pollster, and one that doesn't do as many statewide polls and doesn't do that many national polls frequently. They don't frequent the national electorate or the statewide electorate, and so when they release polls, it also has some substance to it because they aren't here as often, but they also tend to be quite accurate in elections, especially this far out. Quinnipiac University showed that in Pennsylvania, Kamala Harris had a slight edge over Donald Trump in what they argued to be a tight race. New York Times had Kamala Harris up 4 points. Quinnipiac University had her up 3 points, a reduction of 1 point, but still largely in line with the average there in favor of Kamala Harris. And then today, the Franklin and Marshall College poll, which is an entirely in-state poll. They don't do anything nationally. They rarely ever leave the state and haven't recently. Their main focus is only in Pennsylvania, and they actually have found themselves to be quite accurate in recent elections. Not perfect, but quite accurate in a way that many other national pollsters have really missed the mark. And what did they find? That Kamala Harris leads Donald Trump by 3 points, 46 to 43. So the 46 to 43 lead here is also very much in line with what we see on Quinnipiac of a 48 versus 45 point lead, and then a 50 to 46 lead for Kamala Harris in the New York Times poll. One thing is consistent, Kamala Harris is either ahead by 3 or 4 points, and that maintains the average that now shows Kamala Harris leading in the state of Pennsylvania. That is really good news for Kamala Harris, and also just goes to show that these are pollsters that come from very different backgrounds, very different funding sources, very different methodologies in understanding the Pennsylvania electorate. But again, the numbers are clear. Whether it's 3 or 4 points, they would be larger than Joe Biden's victories here back in 2020 and larger than Trump's victory here in 2016. It would be in line even with closer to where Obama got in 2012 than it would be to Joe Biden's 2020 numbers. And that is substantial. Because Kamala Harris being ahead in Pennsylvania goes to show that her level of electability really boils down to the Sun Belt and the Rust Belt, the exact two regions that Kamala Harris was needed the most. It is these 7 battleground states that will make or break the future of the presidential election, and that is the problem for Donald Trump. Because it would be one thing if the New York Times Santa College poll was a fluke, and he tried to write it off as such. His surrogates and even him on Truth Social have gone after many pollsters over the past 3 weeks that have shown Kamala Harris in the advantage point in Pennsylvania. He re-ups some polls that have been done in battleground states, not necessarily Pennsylvania, but other states. The Fox News poll, for instance, that showed Donald Trump with a 1-point advantage, that is very clearly an outlier based on what we're working with nationally, but still he uplifts it. And the reason for that, sure, can be fair. Fox News is a reputable pollster, and I do understand that it makes sense to sort of talk about that when you're discussing your election odds. And when you're a presidential campaign, of course, you're going to be looking for the things that make you look good and the candidate you oppose bad. But beyond that point, there wasn't much else that Donald Trump could really uplift, and we know that he has a long history of attacking pollsters when he disagrees with the results. And so the New York Times one, I'm sure the Trump campaign wrote off as fake news, but then came Quinnipiac University, a nonpartisan poll that doesn't dabble into Democrat or Republican politics, and they found the same thing. And then came another point where Franklin and Marshall College, which again is the in-state, in-house pollster in Pennsylvania, one of the best pollsters in the state, showing Kamala Harris with a 3-point advantage. It is these metrics that show consistency and a lead for Kamala Harris, and something that should terrify Republicans, because when they take a look at the lead for Trump over Harris, even according to Real Clear Politics, when you take a look at where it is, when you're looking at just the 538 averages here, they are far better. Far better for Kamala Harris than you see in some of these other states, rather other websites like Real Clear Politics in Pennsylvania. Kamala Harris is ahead by 2.3%. That, based on their numbers with Joe Biden, is a 6-point swing. 4.5% to 2.3, nearly 7-point swing from where Biden was against Trump. So massive gains that the Trump team has still yet to combat and still yet to see any type of boost in their own battleground states. No improvement in Texas, no improvement in Florida, no improvement in Ohio, no improvement in many of these other states. And the reason why that matters is because, sure, Biden and Harris were never going to win Ohio. They were never going to win Florida. They were never going to win Texas. And we have to be honest with ourselves about that. But the argument that was made by the GOP was that, sure, Kamala Harris could re-inspire the Democratic base, but Trump would re-inspire the Republican base even more against Harris than Trump. Because in their eyes, Kamala Harris is even more liberal, even more left-wing, even more leftist. They said she's a communist, she's from California, yada, yada, yada. They went through the San Francisco trope, many different tropes, leaning into attacking her on racial identity basis. I mean, we saw that the Republican base and the Republican ticket, specifically Donald Trump, oversaw levels of attacks that they could not do correctly against Kamala Harris, and they genuinely believed that her being the Democratic nominee would help them in some states, and in exactly 0 have we seen improvements for Donald Trump. And in every other state, Kamala Harris has made improvements not only in battleground states, but in safe states, red and blue. Not only there too, but on the national level. There is consistency in where Kamala Harris performs. And in Pennsylvania, a state that is so exceptionally important, she is doing well. And that's a major reason why now we have Kamala Harris in the lead in Pennsylvania, where Joe Biden just simply did not. I don't deny that Pennsylvania will be a close state. I still think it'll be under 5 points no matter who wins the election, even if Kamala Harris has a quote-unquote massive victory nationwide. Because Pennsylvania is born to be a battleground state. Republicans are going to spend $80 million over the next 3 months. Democrats are only slated to spend $40 million. And so we will start to see more and more money go into that. We'll see over $100 million spent by the end of the election. But in large, Pennsylvania is one of the most important states of this election cycle, and that cannot be understated. And so now that we're starting to see more data points that are showing Kamala Harris do well in this state, you also have to understand that the perception on the election has changed quite tremendously. Kamala Harris now has a 10-point advantage over Donald Trump in the swing state betting odds. A week ago, Kamala Harris was losing. And Pennsylvania a week ago also had Kamala Harris, if you take a look at the graph here, losing the state. Immediately after the assassination attempt, the odds at which Joe Biden was going to win Pennsylvania went down to 28%. And sure, it recovered to something more reasonable, but around the time that Joe Biden dropped out of the race, it was at a 35% chance, nearly a third of the odds in favor of the Democrats. And since then, and since Joe Biden had departed the race and now entered back, Kamala Harris now entering in, she is at the highest point we have seen for Democrats in a very long time, 58 to 42. A 16-point advantage, enough so that Pennsylvania went from being likely red to lean red, to tilt red, to toss up, and now lean blue. A massive, massive change. And as I said, with Pennsylvania goes Michigan, 65% chance for Kamala Harris victory. Wisconsin, 60% chance for Kamala Harris victory. This is where you see Pennsylvania and the Rust Belt states move in unison in favor of Vice President Harris. And I cannot also ignore the fact that Tim Walz being added onto the ticket has done phenomenal things for Kamala Harris's campaign. She now has in a Midwestern governor who's popular in his state, who has a track record to run on from Congress, who's a veteran, a high school social studies teacher, a football coach, has a story to tell that is very, very different when compared and juxtaposed with that of J.D. Vance, when that of Donald Trump. All private sector, big law, Yale Law School, all of these different things that J.D. Vance doesn't have the ability to appeal to the average voter. There's a reason he underperformed Donald Trump when the national environment was 8 points to the right of what it was in 2020, and yet he did 2 points worse, nearly a 10-point difference that if it was any other type of national circumstance, J.D. Vance would not even be a senator today, and certainly not on the vice presidential ticket. And so J.D. Vance, the bad one. When you take a look at the favorability ratings, just a 33%, 43% of the country has a disapproval 10-point delta between the two. Tim Walz has a 5-point positive. And so very, very different circumstances. And because he hails from the Rust Belt, and because he adds that level of electability, he adds to the Kamala Harris ticket, and the voters are positively responding to that. Whether recent polls or polls from a week ago or 2 weeks ago, Kamala Harris maintains this lead in a way that we haven't seen for Joe Biden at all this entire election cycle. And it is really, really good news for the Democratic Party. In all, Pennsylvania will be a state that could genuinely make or break the Republican or Democratic ticket. Because if I take it away from Kamala Harris on my current election prediction, let's say she wins Michigan, Biden won it by 2.8, it's reasonable to believe that Michigan could go back to Kamala Harris. In this circumstance too, let's say Wisconsin goes to Kamala Harris. Then you take away Pennsylvania. Those 19 electoral votes, if they go to Trump, he wins the election. Right now, he's slated to be the victor in Georgia. Right now, he's slated to be the victor in Arizona. If that happens, Donald Trump genuinely could win the election on Pennsylvania alone. If you take it away from Donald Trump, however, and give it to Kamala Harris, she wins the presidency. Pennsylvania is a super, super close state and a super, super crucial state for both political parties, and it is really hard to see now that Kamala Harris is building out this advantage and expanding her lead. I mean, we see that on the 538 numbers here, she's ahead by 2.8%. On the Real Clear Politics average, Trump is ahead by 0.2%. This is not only leading, but expanding the lead in a way that we haven't seen for Joe Biden in a really long time. And this would be a strong, strong, strong election performance, because I have to be honest with you too. If Pennsylvania becomes a 3-4 point state for Kamala Harris, she's winning Georgia, she's winning Arizona, and she might even win North Carolina as well. Because a victory of that nature would be well beyond where it was even for Trump in 2016 or Biden in 2020, and feel reminiscent of what we saw with Obama back in 2012 with an expanded Democratic coalition, more fundraising ever, more money ever, more resources at the disposal of the Democratic ticket, and a honed-in electoral strategy that is far narrower than the 2008, 2012, 2016, and 2020 campaigns of what was 10-plus swing states have now been reduced down to 7. The Democrats have committed over $250 million to in the stretch after Labor Day weekend. A huge, huge, huge ad reservation dump, one that will benefit the Democratic Party quite tremendously in a way that Kamala Harris, is already starting to do. She's changing the perception, she's changing the momentum, and she's building out a broader coalition in a way that Democrats had not been able to do under Joe Biden, and the numbers not only are consistent, but they come from some of the best pollsters in Pennsylvania, a state that will matter the most in this election, and they all say one thing: Kamala Harris is winning Pennsylvania. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the top left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.